I am Kathryn Hale, 65 years old, a retired bookkeeper, and the woman who woke up one morning to find her entire house stripped of life. That day, I opened my eyes and felt something wrong in the air. It was too still, too hollow, the kind of silence that hums in your bones. I sat up, placed my feet on the cold floor, and whispered a sentence I never imagined would belong to my life. I woke up, and the house was empty. Not quiet. Empty. As if someone had lifted my world by its corners and shaken out everything that once made it mine. I stood in the hallway and felt my breath catch. The living room, where the scent of old books and cedar used to greet me, had become a hollow shell. The couch I used to mend. The lamp my husband bought at a yard sale because he said it looked like something from a lighthouse. The woven rug where I used to rest my feet during winter. All gone. The space looked like a rental unit waiting for a stranger. For a second, I thought I had wandered into the wrong home. My fingers trembled as I touched the wall, the same wall where my husband once leaned his forehead when his heart condition made him tired. There was no trace of us, no trace of him. Even the picture frame that held our wedding photo for nearly 40 years had vanished. The only mark left was a faint rectangle of clean paint. A rush of dizziness swept over me. I gripped the doorframe and closed my eyes, and in that darkness, a faint memory flickered. A younger me, laughing on the front porch, flower on my cheek, while my husband placed a silver bracelet around my wrist. That bracelet is still with me. It is the one thing no one could take, because I kept it close, even in sleep. In the flashback, sunlight warmed my face. The house felt full, alive, safe. Then the memory faded like breath on glass, leaving me alone in the stripped-down present. I stepped into the kitchen. The table was gone. The chairs, the ceramic bowl I used to fill with fruit. The only thing left was the outline of dust where the microwave once sat. My hands shook as I opened cabinet after cabinet, only to find them hollowed out like rib cages. I whispered to myself, not crying, not panicking, just stunned. This was not a burglary. This was too deliberate, too thorough. This was a choice. The vibration of my phone on the counter startled me. I picked it up, and before I could speak, I heard my son Evan's voice. Bright, distracted, cheerful in a way that did not match the devastation around me. "Mom," he said, "you're awake. Good." My mouth opened, but the words wouldn't leave. He continued, his tone floating, distant, like he was calling from a dream instead of thousands of miles away. "Sophie deserves Paris, Mom. She needed a break. We needed a break. I hope you understand. Paris." I stared at the barren living room again, the house they stripped before flying away for vacation, the house that belonged to me, the house I built with years of double shifts and quiet sacrifices. And yet here he was, talking about Paris as if it justified everything, as if Sophie deserving Paris meant she also deserved the life I had lived, the home I had made, and the memories I carried. I felt something unusual stir inside me. Not anger, not grief, something steadier, quieter, a stillness that spread across my chest like a calm tide. "I see," I said. He exhaled in relief, as if expecting drama, as if expecting pleading, as if expecting me to beg for pieces of the life they had taken. "Thanks, Mom," he said. "You always make things easier." When the call ended, I looked around the empty room again, and for the first time in years, I felt my spine straighten. I felt my breath deepen, steady, grounded. I felt the weight of the silver bracelet on my wrist, my anchor. Then I did the last thing my son ever expected. I smiled, a small, quiet smile that held no resentment and no submission, only clarity. People imagine that the breaking point is loud, but mine was silent. Almost tender. That morning, the emptiness they left behind became a kind of doorway, a space where my life had been unplugged just long enough for me to see how much of it I had surrendered, how much of myself I had forgotten to keep. The quiet was no longer frightening, it was instructive. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and traced the silver bracelet with my thumb. I whispered something to myself, not out of bitterness, but out of certainty. They believed they had taken everything they needed. They believed the story was already written. They believed I would wait. But 15 days later, Sophie fainted on the spot. And in that moment, they finally understood what I had done with the silence they left me. 15 days later, they did not know what I had prepared. And now, before we go deeper into this journey, if you believe quiet strength matters, if you believe every woman deserves to reclaim her place, feel free to like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss the next chapters of my story. Your support means more than you know. When I think back to the years that shaped me, the years that softened my voice and strengthened my hands, I realize they were never loud. They were built quietly, the way a house settles into its foundation over time. After that morning when I woke to an empty home, I found myself drawn into memories I had tucked away for decades. Not because they hurt, but because they explained everything about how I became the kind of woman who could be erased without protest. I was 23 when I married my husband. He had a gentle smile and a heart condition that worried his mother, though he always brushed it off with a laugh. When his health declined, I picked up a second job without making a sound about it. During the day, I worked at a small insurance office typing forms and filing claims. At night, I cleaned classrooms at the local elementary school, mopping floors that smelled of chalk dust and crayons. My hands grew calloused, the skin on my knuckles cracking every winter. I remember rubbing lotion into them during short breaks, watching the faint gleam of my silver bracelet catch the fluorescent light. That bracelet was my anchor even then. I used my paychecks to keep us afloat, to cover his medication, to repair the roof when a storm tore through the shingles, to save for the small house that would one day become the one Evan and Sophie emptied without hesitation. Every dollar mattered. I can still recall placing them, one by one, into an envelope at the end of each week, smoothing its surface as if I were smoothing the future. My husband always apologized for being sick, for not being able to provide the way he wanted. I always told him he provided enough just by being kind, but kindness, I learned later, can become a habit so deeply rooted that it turns into silence. By the time Evan was born, I had already grown used to standing behind the needs of others. He was a bright child, tender and curious, with eyes that widened whenever I fixed something in the house. I patched torn clothes, maintained the garden, handled the bills, and repaired leaky faucets. He grew up believing that problems simply disappeared, smoothed out by unseen hands. He never saw the exhaustion that followed me into bed each night. Children rarely do. Without realizing it, he learned to walk forward while assuming someone else had laid the path. I became the path. When my husband passed away, Evan was 17. The grief pressed into me like a heavy coat, but I knew I had to stay upright for his sake. So I kept going, working extra hours, cooking his favorite meals, even when the house felt hollow, without the sound of his father's laughter. I never complained, not when the bills piled higher, not when loneliness settled into the corners of the house, not when Evan left for college and called home only when he needed something. My quietness became my identity. People often assume that silence means weakness, but to me, it was endurance. Still, endurance can make you invisible. Years later, when Evan first brought Sophie to a family dinner, I wanted desperately to like her. She walked in with a polite smile, her hair pulled back neatly, her perfume light and expensive. She complimented the roast chicken and thanked me for setting the table, but her eyes were restless. They drifted along the walls, the furniture, the framed photos of Evan's childhood. She scanned my home the way someone scans the clearance section of a store, looking for flaws, mentally pricing the effort it would take to replace everything. I felt it, a soft prickle under my skin, the same prickle you feel when someone judges not who you are, but what you are worth. She was kind in her words, but her gaze held a quiet criticism, an evaluation I couldn't quite name. I noticed how she paused at the wedding photo of me and my husband. The picture had faded over time, the edges curled slightly. My husband's smile looked softer now, almost ghostly, as if the years had washed the ink thinner. Sophie tilted her head, offered a tight smile, and moved on without a comment. But the air shifted. That evening, after they left, I sat alone at the dining table. Evan's glass still held a ring of water, and the leftover chicken cooled on the counter. I traced my thumb along the silver bracelet, its surface worn smooth by decades of living. In the kitchen window, I saw a faint reflection of myself, shoulders slightly hunched, hair graying at the temples, eyes tired. It was the first time I wondered if kindness had cost me too much. My neighbor, Mildred Dawson, noticed things long before I did. She had taught for over 40 years and could read people the way others read weather forecasts. One afternoon, as we sipped tea on her porch, she watched Evan and Sophie pull into my driveway and said, "They love you, Kathryn, but your boy treats you like the shadow that follows the sun. He never asks where you stand because he assumes you'll always stay behind him." I let out a small laugh, brushing it off, but her words clung to me. A shadow, a background shape, a useful silence. Those quiet years built the woman I became, the woman they believed could be erased. And maybe, back then, I believed that too. I had lived so much of my life taking care of others that I forgot how to stand fully in my own place. But as I looked at the reflection in Mildred's teacup that day, the soft lines on my face, the silver bracelet gleaming faintly, I felt a flicker of something I couldn't yet name, a memory of my own weight, a reminder that shadows still belong to something solid. I just didn't know yet how deeply that truth would matter when the house finally emptied. The shift began quietly, the way seasons change before you notice the leaves. After Evan married Sophie, they asked if they could stay with me for a short while. Sophie had smiled at me across the dinner table, her voice light and reassuring as she said, "We will only be here for a few weeks while we look for something nearby." It felt reasonable, even sweet in a way. I wanted them to save money, to start their life without unnecessary strain. So I nodded and told them my home was theirs. But the weeks stretched into months. Their shoes multiplied in the entryway. New kitchen gadgets appeared on the counter. Makeup containers collected around the bathroom sink. My routines shifted to make space for theirs without anyone noticing but me. When I mentioned a rental listing I had seen, Evan brushed it off with a gentle laugh. "Sophie likes it here, Mom. She feels comfortable." He said it as if comfort was a simple truth, not something that had slowly crept into every corner of my house like mist. At first, it was little things. Sophie preferred her own cooking style, so she took over the kitchen. She had a talent for it, and I did not mind stepping aside. But I began to notice how rarely she asked if I had already planned a meal. I started eating earlier, quietly, with a plate balanced on my lap so I would not be in the way. During one dinner, I set the table with my wooden dining chairs, the ones my husband had sanded and varnished 3 separate times because he loved the warm look of oak. Sophie slipped into her seat, ran her fingers along the backrest, and said with a soft laugh, "These chairs are so old-fashioned. They remind me of my grandma's basement." Evan chuckled as if it were harmless, but the comment pierced me in a place I did not have words for. The chairs were not furniture to me. They were the last things my husband's hands had shaped. I kept quiet, but the room felt smaller after that, as if the air had thinned. Another time, I returned from a doctor's appointment. It was a routine checkup, nothing serious, but I felt tired. When I opened my bedroom door, I stopped short. My dresser drawers were open, my sweaters folded in tight stacks they had never been in before. My scarves were arranged by color. A few items were missing, ones I later found stuffed in a donation bag by the garage. Sophie walked past the doorway holding a basket of laundry and gave me an apologetic smile. "I reorganized your things while you were gone, just trying to make everything neat." I managed to thank you, though the words felt stiff in my mouth. Something inside me twisted. My belongings had always been a quiet landscape that held my history. No one had touched them since my husband died. Seeing them handled, sorted, evaluated made my chest tighten. Later that week, I overheard Sophie on her phone while she stood outside on the porch. I was watering the basil plant by the kitchen window, and her voice floated through the open door, crisp and careless. "She has too much stuff. Old people never throw anything away." The sentence felt like a hand closing around my ribcage. Old people. Too much stuff. I looked around my kitchen, at the faded recipe cards I had handwritten over the years, the ceramic mug with a tiny chip on the rim, the little radio that still played classical music on Sundays. Were these things cluttering her, or reminders of a life she believed should be packed away to make room for her own? That night, I lay awake replaying her words. Was I becoming a burden without meaning to? Was I holding on to the past too tightly? I tried to reason with myself, telling my mind to stay steady, but the questions kept circling. Was I making my son's life harder without realizing, or was I simply growing older in a world that does not know how to honor age anymore? I remembered holding Evan as a baby, rocking him when he cried, smoothing his hair when he had fevers. I remembered telling him he did not need to be afraid of the dark because I was right there. Watching him side with Sophie so effortlessly now made something ache in me that was deeper than disappointment. It felt like erasure. Evan did not mean harm, I knew that. He loved his wife, and love makes people lean in one direction without noticing how far they tilt. But each time he defended her, even in small ways, it felt like I slid further into the background of my own home. One evening, while wiping the counter after they finished cooking, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. My shoulders were slightly hunched, my eyes tired. I wondered if I looked older to them than I felt to myself. The silver bracelet glinted faintly under the overhead light, and I touched it, grounding myself. That bracelet had survived decades of storms, grief, and rebuilding, yet here I was questioning my worth because of casual words spoken by someone who barely knew my life. I whispered a question into the quiet kitchen. Was age turning me into an inconvenience? The silence did not answer, but it held the weight of the doubt I had begun to carry, and that doubt was the first sign, not of their cruelty, but of the slow unraveling that would one day leave my house empty. The changes did not arrive with the force of a storm. They came softly, almost politely, like someone tapping on a door until the hinges loosen. After the first signs, life inside my home shifted again. This time in ways so subtle I worried I was imagining them. But I wasn't. Sophie began bringing home new things. Small at first, a decorative vase with a sharp modern design, all angles and chrome, a set of glass shelves that looked sleek but fragile, a pair of minimalist lamps that cast a cold white light instead of the warm glow my husband used to prefer. She did not ask where these items should go. She simply placed them where she thought they belonged. The old objects, my objects, began disappearing. I noticed the change one afternoon when I opened the hallway closet and found my woven blanket, the one my mother stitched for me when I first left home, shoved into a plastic storage bin. I pulled it out and brushed my fingers over the fading threads, the tiny uneven stitches that told the story of my lineage, but there was no space for it anymore in the living room. A new throw, gray and geometric, now lay on the couch in its place. I folded the blanket gently and set it back into the storage bin. The lid latched with a hollow click that stayed with me for days. Soon after, I found a cluster of my photo albums in the garage stacked behind a row of paint cans. My husband's toolbox had been moved to a back corner. A cedar keepsake box containing old letters had been placed on a shelf so high I needed a stool to reach it. Evan noticed me standing among the displaced boxes one evening and said with an easy shrug, "Mom, you live pretty simply. I don't think any of this stuff matters to you, right?" The words were casual, tossed into the air like a harmless observation, but they landed heavily. Live simply, as if simplicity were something I chose because I had no inner world, as if the objects I held onto, the ones woven with decades of memories, were insignificant in the face of his wife's preferences. I opened my mouth, thinking I might correct him, but no words came out. I just nodded, and he smiled, relieved that the conversation was easy, uncomplicated, undemanding, as I had always been. A few days later, the deepest cut arrived quietly. I woke early, the way I always did. Morning light filtered through the blinds, soft and golden. I made my tea and walked toward the kitchen with the same instinctive steps I had taken for years. But when I reached the counter, something felt off. The air felt wrong, as if a familiar scent had vanished. Then I saw it. The chair I always sat in, my chair, was gone. It had been a simple wooden chair, steady and slightly creaky, the one place where I started each morning with a warm mug and a few minutes of quiet. My husband used to tease me about it. "You treat that chair like an old friend," he would say. Maybe I did. Maybe that chair held the last echoes of a life that no longer existed except in my memory, and now it is gone, replaced by two tall metal stools that looked like they belonged in a modern bar. I stood still, my hand tightening around the mug. I felt something press against my ribs, not sharp enough to hurt, but firm enough to remind me that loss does not always require death. Sometimes loss arrives in the form of a missing chair. Sophie breezed into the kitchen moments later. She slipped past me with her phone in one hand and a pair of sunglasses in the other. She smiled at me, bright and thoughtless. I moved the chairs to match the new decor. The old ones were too bulky. "You don't mind, right?" I said nothing. Silence was safer. Silence was easier. Silence was what they expected from me, but this silence felt different. Heavier, deeper, shaped not by fear, but by an awakening I did not yet understand. Later that day, I stepped outside to water the plants when I saw Mildred leaning over her fence, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the new items Sophie had placed on my porch. She took one long, slow breath and shook her head. When I walked over, she didn't bother with gentle words. "Kathryn," she said, "you give people one step and they will walk straight into your heart and rearrange the furniture." I laughed weakly, though there was no humor in her words. She continued, her voice softening. "You have spent your whole life squeezing yourself smaller so others can breathe, but a woman can only shrink so far before she disappears." I looked down at my hands, at the faint outline of the silver bracelet on my wrist. My skin felt thinner somehow, as if time had worn through it. She was right. Something was slipping. Not just my belongings, but pieces of myself. And yet all I did was nod and whisper, "I'm fine, Mildred." But I wasn't. I was drifting further from the center of my own home, becoming a quiet shape moving around someone else's life. And each loss, each missing object, each shift in the space I once belonged to, pushed me closer to an edge I didn't know I was standing on. I just didn't realize then that this edge would soon give way to the morning when the house emptied completely. I did not realize how far I had slipped into the background of my own home until the day Sophie's family came to visit. It was a Saturday afternoon, bright and warm, the kind of day that once would have filled my house with laughter when my husband was alive. I had baked a small batch of lemon cookies, out of habit rather than invitation, and arranged them neatly on a plate. When Sophie's parents walked through the door, their eyes scanned the house with polite curiosity, much like she had done the first time she visited. Sophie introduced me with a cheerful tone, but I could feel how she positioned herself in front, as if presenting her territory rather than her home. Her mother gave me a gentle smile and asked, in a voice that sounded like she was talking to someone fragile, "Do you live alone here? Doesn't it get lonely?" I felt a tightness in my throat. The question was innocent enough, but something about the way she said it made me feel as though solitude was a flaw, a sign of being left behind. I wanted to tell her that I had lived through far heavier nights, that loneliness had shaped me long before Sophie entered my son's life. Instead, I just smiled and said I managed fine. Sophie's father nodded, though his eyes held the same pitying softness, the kind reserved for old items sitting on a dusty shelf. Then, while they admired the new decor Sophie had added, I overheard her speaking quietly to her mother in the dining room. "Evan is the only one carrying the financial load. Mom, you would not believe how much he does for us." I stopped where I stood. The words hit me like a door closing. It was not true. For years, I had covered unexpected bills, helped with car repairs, bought them groceries when they struggled. Evan knew it. Sophie knew it. Yet she said it so easily, with a tone that made me feel like a ghost drifting through the walls, present but irrelevant. Her mother responded with a sympathetic cluck of the tongue, something between admiration for Evan and concern for Sophie. I felt heat rise to my face, not anger, Not yet. More like a slow burn of sadness mixing with an uncomfortable truth. In my own home, I had become the least important voice. I excused myself and went to my room under the pretense of needing rest. Once the door closed, the silence wrapped around me like a familiar coat. I sat on the edge of the bed, tracing the outline of the silver bracelet on my wrist. My thumb moved across its surface, worn smooth by decades of holding on. As I sat there, a memory floated back, soft and uninvited. My husband is lying in our bed during his final weeks, his breathing shallow but steady. I remember sitting next to him, holding his hand as he whispered, "You always make everything look easy, Kathryn. Even the hard things." I smiled, though tears blurred my vision. Losing him had been the first time I felt myself fade, not because I wanted to, but because grief dims everything it touches. I closed my eyes, letting the memory fold around me like a fragile blanket. His absence felt sharper now, as if he had been the only person who ever truly saw me. A knock at the door pulled me back. Evan stepped inside, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Mom," he said softly, "try not to make things complicated for Sophie." I stared at him, words frozen somewhere deep in my chest. Complicated. That word echoed inside me, bouncing against memories of years spent smoothing over every difficulty for him, changing schedules, taking extra shifts, fixing problems before he even knew they existed. And now, here he was asking me not to complicate things for the woman who had moved into my home and rearranged my life. I managed to say, "I didn't mean to complicate anything." He exhaled with relief, as if my agreement allowed him to return to a more comfortable world where I stayed quiet and undemanding. When he left, closing the door behind him, I felt something inside me shift. Not break, just shift. I sat there holding my bracelet, feeling the metal warm under my fingers. Was I really becoming a problem simply by existing? Was age turning me into something inconvenient? Something to be managed? That question lingered long after the house grew quiet again, and for the first time, I sensed the beginnings of something I could not yet name, an awareness, faint but growing, that invisibility has a cost. A cost I had paid far too long without realizing. The uneasiness began quietly, almost delicately, like a draft slipping under a door. At first, I thought it was simply age catching up to me, the natural forgetfulness people warned me about. But it wasn't forgetfulness. It disappeared. The first thing I noticed missing was my teapot. It was a simple ceramic pot chipped near the spout, something my husband had bought from a street vendor during one of our rare weekend getaways. I used it every morning. It had never left the kitchen counter. One Tuesday, I reached for it and felt my fingers touch an empty space instead of warm ceramic. I checked every cabinet, every shelf, even the dishwasher. Nothing. When Evan passed through the kitchen, slipping his keys into his pocket, I asked if he had seen it. He barely paused. "Mom, you probably put it somewhere else and forgot. You misplace things sometimes." His tone wasn't cruel, but it held that same softness people reserve for children and the elderly. I felt a small sting behind my ribs, but I nodded. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe. But a few days later, something else vanished. This time, it was my wedding photograph, the one that had sat on my bedside table for years. The frame was wooden, slightly worn, but the picture inside was precious. My husband's hand resting over mine, both of us grinning shyly at the camera as if we knew our best years were ahead of us. One night, it was there. The next morning, the surface of the nightstand was bare. My heart tightened in confusion. I opened the drawers, removed the books stacked neatly inside, even checked under the bed. Nothing. When I asked Sophie, she looked up from her tablet with a polite smile. "I haven't seen it." "Maybe you moved it while dusting?" Her tone was gentle, almost sweet, but something in her eyes, something sharp and fleeting, made my stomach twist. Later that week, the embroidered tablecloth I had sewn decades ago disappeared too. Stitch by stitch, I had worked that cloth during long nights when my husband slept in the hospital. Each flower on it carried the shape of my worry, my hope, my prayers. It had always been draped across the dining table, surviving years of spills, celebrations, and quiet breakfasts. Now it is gone. By then, an uneasiness had settled inside me like a stone. I tried to steady myself, tried to be rational. Things get moved, houses change, people reorganize. But the pattern was too precise. The missing items were not random. They were pieces of my life, my history, my identity. I asked Evan again, trying to keep my voice steady, "Have you seen the tablecloth? Or the photo from my room?" He frowned as if the question inconvenienced him. "Mom, you're always worrying. I'm sure you just misplaced them. You keep things everywhere. Everywhere." The word lodged deep, like an accusation. Before I could respond, Sophie stepped into the room carrying a small stack of folded laundry. She placed it on the couch and looked at me with a smile that felt almost rehearsed. "Sometimes old memories just take up space, Kathryn." Her voice was soft, airy, almost soothing, but the meaning pressed into me like a thumb against a bruise. Old memories take up space. My throat tightened. I felt my eyes drift toward the hallway closet where the old blanket from my mother now sat in a bin, the garage where my albums had been shoved out of sight, the living room where the oak chairs were gone, the kitchen where my teapot had vanished into nothing. A strange panic fluttered inside me. Not loud, not frantic, just a quiet, persistent ache. Was my life taking up too much space? Was I? That question settled heavier than any missing item. I turned away before they could see my face shift. In my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence gather around me. I pressed my fingers along the silver bracelet on my wrist, feeling the familiar grooves, the dents left by time. It grounded me the way nothing else could anymore. But even as I held it, a terrible thought crept in. What if one day this disappeared too? What if I woke up and found the last piece of my past swallowed by someone else's vision of the future? The moral conflict twisted deeper, whispering that maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was aging into inconvenience. Maybe I was forgetting things, not because they were missing, but because I was slipping. A part of me tried to believe that. I tried to blame myself. But another part, a quiet ember inside me, knew this was not forgetfulness. It was erased. And something, someone, was slowly clearing space where my life used to stand. That morning arrived with an unusual quiet, the kind that settles before a change you cannot yet name. I woke before the sun because something felt wrong in the air, a stillness that did not belong to a living house. I slipped my feet into my slippers, tied my robe loosely, and walked into the hallway with the familiar heaviness of someone who has spent too many months shrinking herself to fit the space others created. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. The living room was empty, not untidy, not rearranged. Empty. The walls felt taller, the windows wider, the air colder. The rug was gone. The couch, the lamps, the shelves, even the small wooden bowl I kept near the doorway, now just a faint circle of dust marking where it had once stood. I walked deeper into the room, my breath catching as my eyes followed the patterns of scratches on the floor. Each one told a story. The time Evan dragged the chair too quickly and apologized, laughing. The night my husband accidentally dropped his toolbox. The day I moved the coffee table to sweep underneath. I knelt down, running my fingers along one long scratch near the center of the room. The mark felt rough, still holding its history even after everything around it had vanished. Loss has a strange texture when you can touch it. My mind reached for logic. Maybe they moved things to clean, maybe this was temporary. But logic could not explain the missing dining table. My husband built that table himself. He sanded it for days in the garage, humming to the radio, stopping only when I brought him lemonade. When he finished, he carved our initials underneath the corner so faintly that only we would know it was there. I walked to the dining room, and the bare floor greeted me like a wound. The ghost of the table remained only in the memory of its weight on the tiles. I stood in the doorway, letting the silence fold over me. A soft swirl of a memory rose. My husband sitting at that table, polishing the final coat of varnish, smiling at me like he was building a future worth keeping. Now that future had been dragged away in the night. I instinctively touched my wrist, the silver bracelet warm against my skin, as if reminding me I was still here even if everything else was gone. My phone vibrated in the kitchen. I followed the sound, stepping around sunlit patches on the floor where furniture once blocked the light. The counter was bare except for the phone, buzzing insistently. Evan's name glowed on the screen. My heart tightened. I answered with a quiet hello. His voice burst through, cheerful, bright, completely mismatched to the hollow space around me. "Mom, you're awake. I hoped you'd see everything by now." His tone carried no apology, no hesitation, just comfort in his own decisions. I swallowed, letting my eyes drift across the emptied kitchen. Where my teapot once sat, there was nothing but a faint square of clean countertop. He continued speaking, his voice echoing slightly in the bare room. "Sophie deserves Paris, Mom. She really needed this. We both did." My breath stilled. Paris. The reason. The justification. The explanation offered without remorse. I saw the image too easily. Sophie leaning against him in some bright hotel lobby, sipping expensive coffee, smiling with the ease of someone certain of her place in the world. And here, thousands of miles away, stood the home they stripped overnight. Not because they needed space, but because they believed I would not protest. Because my silence had taught them I would endure anything. He waited for my reaction. I could feel it through the phone, a quiet expectation, a familiar confidence that I would make things easy. I let my gaze travel through the living room again, moving slowly across the bare floor, the empty corners, the lingering marks that proved the life that had once lived here. I felt something shift inside me, a soft, deep pivot. Not anger, not a shock, something steadier, clearer. "I see," I finally said. 2 words, soft, even. But he heard what he needed to hear, mistaking calm for consent. "Thank you, Mom. You always understand." When the call ended, I stood in the center of the empty room. The morning light touched the walls gently, as if trying to comfort them. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet settle into my bones, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no urge to explain myself, no urge to defend anything I had lost. A slow breath moved through me. Then quietly, I smiled, a small, knowing smile, a smile that carried no bitterness, only clarity. In that silence, a vow took shape, not loud, not dramatic, but steady as stone. A vow that the next chapter of my life would not be taken from me. A vow that 15 days from now, they would return to a version of me they had never seen, and the emptiness surrounding me would become the very thing that woke me up. In the days that followed, silence became my closest companion, not the painful kind, not the silence of rejection or shock, but a deliberate quiet, measured, calm, and strangely powerful. I did not call Evan. I did not text Sophie. I did not demand explanations. Instead, I let the empty rooms breathe around me, giving them space to settle into their new shape, while I gathered myself for the first time in years. On the 3rd day, I found the business card tucked into the back of my husband's old address book, Simon Graves. His handwriting beside it read, "Trust him." The memory came back in soft fragments. Simon sitting with my husband on the porch years ago, discussing legal documents while sipping tea. He had always treated me with a gentle respect, speaking to me directly instead of through my husband like some men did. I dialed his number, half expecting it to no longer work, but he answered immediately. "Kathryn, I recognized your voice before you spoke your name. What's wrong?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound emotional. "I think I need some help understanding what's mine," I said, "and what others believe they can take." He was at my house within 2 hours. When he walked in and saw the empty rooms, his jaw tightened. He set his briefcase down slowly, then turned to me with the steady gaze of someone who has spent decades navigating the worst in people. "Kathryn, who emptied your home?" "My son and his wife," I replied calmly. "They flew to Paris afterward. I waited for him to ask why I didn't stop them, why I allowed it, but he didn't. Instead, he opened a folder, placed a pair of glasses on his nose, and began examining the property deeds I provided. After several minutes, he looked up. Every object in this house purchased before their marriage belongs solely to you. The house is in your name alone. They had no right to remove anything, let alone sell it. A strange steadiness filled my chest, not anger, validation. Simon closed the folder and continued, "You're not taking revenge by taking back what's yours. This is the minimum you're entitled to. The minimum." Something about the word unlocked a small breath inside me, as if I had been holding my lungs too tightly for too long. We began walking through the house. He took notes, photographed the empty rooms, and documented the missing list I had scribbled down. My wedding photo, my table, my teapot, my mother's blanket. All of it recorded, acknowledged, restored in meaning. On the 7th day, he arranged for the locks to be changed, a legal action he assured me was within my rights. The locksmith worked quietly, respectful, glancing occasionally at the bare living room as if sensing the weight of the story behind it. When he handed me the new keys, they felt heavier than expected, not because of the metal, but because of what they represented. Ownership, agency, a returned place in my own life. I spent the next few days sorting through my documents, birth certificates, insurance papers, property records, my husband's handwritten notes. I placed everything into labeled folders, lined them neatly in a wooden drawer, and felt something tighten and realign inside me. My life, once scattered around other people's needs, now sat in a place I controlled. On the 10th day, I chose to repaint the living room, not to erase the scratches on the floor, not yet, but to strip away the heaviness Sophie's decor had left behind. I chose soft, warm colors that reminded me of early mornings with my husband. When the paint dried, I brought in a single chair, a small table, and a vase of fresh eucalyptus. Minimalist, clean, simple, but mine. I did not try to recreate the house that once existed. That life was gone. I wanted something new, something uncluttered by the noise of years spent making myself smaller. Each brushstroke, each piece of furniture I placed, felt like I was reclaiming oxygen, reclaiming memory, reclaiming self. On the 12th day, I sat at the small table and wrote a letter addressed to Evan. I wrote slowly, carefully, choosing each word with tenderness. I told him I loved him. I told him I had forgiven his blindness long before he realized he had any. I told him I missed the boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and excited stories. But then I reached the part where I needed to explain the boundaries I had created, the locks, the legal steps, the changes he would find upon returning. My hand hovered over the paper. The words looked heavy, too soaked in the past. Without thinking too long, I folded the letter once, then again. I tore it down the middle, then into quarters, then into pieces so small they could no longer speak for me. I dropped them into the trash gently, as if laying down something sacred that no longer served my life. On the 15th day, I stood in the center of my newly quiet living room. The sunlight touched the walls in soft gold. The new furniture stood peacefully in its place. My hands rested at my sides, steady, and for the first time in decades, I felt the fullness of my own presence in a room, without apology, without explanation, without shrinking. I whispered to myself, not as a threat, but as a truth. When they return, I will no longer be invisible, and the silence they left me with will become the voice they never expected. On the 16th morning, the sound of a car door slamming broke the quiet rhythm I had built during those 15 days. I stood in the hallway, hidden from sight, and listened to the chatter outside. Bright, careless voices, the rolling thump of heavy suitcases hitting the porch steps, the rustling of shopping bags stuffed with things they did not need. Evan and Sophie were home. I watched through the narrow gap between the curtains as they walked toward the house, laughing, sunburned from their trip, the kind of relaxed happiness that comes from believing the world will always make space for you. Sophie leaned into him, pressing a kiss to his cheek while adjusting her oversized sunglasses. Evan carried 2 luxury shopping bags on one arm and dragged a large suitcase with the other. They looked like a couple returning from a honeymoon, not from an escape built on the emptiness of someone else's life. When Evan reached for the doorknob, I saw the first crack in his confidence. He twisted the handle once, then again, confused, pulling harder. The lock didn't budge. His brows drew together. Sophie stepped forward with a small huff, trying the handle herself, as if her touch might fix something he couldn't. But the door remained closed. Evan knocked lightly, then louder. "Mom, are you home?" There was a hint of irritation under his voice, discomfort from something he couldn't yet name. I waited until I felt ready. Then I walked to the door and opened it with the calm grace of someone who had been expecting this moment. Their eyes widened when they saw me standing there, composed, steady, completely unshaken. Sophie's smile faltered first. Evan's confusion followed. "Mom, why is the lock?" His voice trailed off. I stepped aside without answering. "Come in." They dragged their suitcases inside, their eyes scanning the living room with bewilderment. The space looked nothing like the home they had emptied. The soft paint, the minimalist furniture, the vase of eucalyptus, everything was clean, simple, intentional. Mine. Sophie's gaze darted from corner to corner, searching for the things she once curated, as if unable to believe the house had dared to exist without her. Evan finally spoke, pointing toward the room with disbelief. "Mom, what happened to everything? Where's the furniture?" My hands rested on my lap, calm, still as water. I just made some changes. His mouth opened, then closed. The silence stretched. Sophie took a step forward, voice trembling with a mix of offense and fear. "You changed the locks without telling us?" There it was, the accusation shaped like concern. The moral argument flipped backward. I met her eyes without flinching. "I changed the locks because it is my house." Evan exhaled sharply, frustration rising. "Mom, how could you do this to us, after everything we've done?" I tilted my head slightly, studying his face, not with anger, but with a clarity he had never seen from me. "What exactly have you done, Evan?" he stuttered. We trusted you. We left everything here." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Everything. I let the silence sit for a long, heavy moment, the kind that forces truth to surface. Then I reached for the silver bracelet on my wrist, the bracelet my husband had given me decades ago. Slowly, deliberately, I unclasped it, letting the soft metallic click cut through the room. I placed it on the small table beside me. Its gleam looked startling in the morning light. I watched their eyes follow it, and in the gentlest voice I could manage, I asked, "This? Did you plan to sell this too?" The question landed like a stone dropped into water, quiet but heavy, rippling outward with undeniable truth. Sophie's face was drained of color. Evan froze, his breath catching. "Mom, we never—" But the sentence crumbled before he could finish, because buried in his silence was the answer neither of them wanted to face. It wasn't just the furniture they had moved. It wasn't just the decorations they'd replaced. It was the pieces of my life, the last fragments of my history that they had treated like clutter meant to be cleared. Evan stepped toward me, his voice trembling now, small in a way I had never heard before. "You didn't have to do all of this. You could have talked to us." I held his gaze, letting my calm speak louder than any anger ever could. "You emptied my home without speaking to me. You sold what wasn't yours. You left without asking if I was all right. And now you want to talk." The silence that followed was different from any silence I had ever given them. It was not quietness out of habit. It was quietness rooted in strength, a strength they had overlooked their entire lives. This wasn't revenge. This was the truth settling into the room, a reckoning shaped not by fury, but by clarity. And in that clarity, I knew this confrontation was only the beginning. The room held its breath as my bracelet lay on the table, glinting like a truth neither of them wanted to face. Evan swallowed hard, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Sophie stared at the bracelet with wide, glassy eyes, her fingers trembling slightly against her purse strap. Their silence told me everything long before their words ever could. I stood slowly, letting the quiet stretch, letting it speak for me with a calmness I had earned the hard way. "There's something I want to show you," I said. My voice was steady, almost gentle. That gentleness made Sophie flinch more than anger ever could. Evan exchanged a glance with her, uncertainty settling into his expression. But they followed me down the hallway. Each step echoed softly off the freshly painted walls, the sound strangely ceremonial, like a walk toward a truth that could no longer be postponed. I stopped in front of the small storage room near the back of the house. They had never paid attention to this room before. It was where I kept documents, memories, things too important to discard yet too delicate to display. These 15 days, it had become something else entirely. I opened the door. Evan inhaled sharply. Sophie froze. The room was no longer just storage. Every inch of the wall was covered, neatly, methodically, with documents, photographs, printouts, and itemized lists. Receipts taped carefully side by side showing the dates they sold my belongings. Photos I had taken with Simon's help of the empty spaces where each item once sat. Bank statements showing the deposits from the sales, transfers made when they thought I would never notice. Screenshots of online listings where my handmade tablecloth, my teapot, even my wedding photograph had appeared. Every truth they tried to bury stood on the wall, undeniable. I had printed everything on crisp white paper so the evidence looked stark against the soft-colored walls. The room felt colder now, not because of temperature, but because truth absorbs warmth before it sets people free. Sophie's purse slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a muted thud. Her face was drained of color. "Kathryn, what is this?" Her voice cracked on the last word. Evan stepped forward, his breath uneven, scanning the wall frantically as if searching for a version of reality that made him innocent. "Mom, we didn't mean—" His words tangled, breaking apart under the weight of the evidence. I didn't speak. I simply watched them absorb what they had done, piece by piece, page by page. Silence wrapped around us, thick and unavoidable. Sophie's hand shot out, toward the wall as if she could physically erase the truth. Her fingers brushed across the photo of the empty dining room, then the receipt showing the sale of my husband's handcrafted table. Her knees buckled slightly. She tried to steady herself, but her balance faltered. Evan reached for her, but he was too late. Her eyes rolled back, her breath hitched, and she collapsed. The sound of her body hitting the floor echoed sharply in the small room. Evan shouted her name, kneeling beside her, panic flooding his features. "Sophie! Sophie! Sophie, wake up!" He shook her gently, his voice trembling. She didn't respond. Her breaths were quick and shallow, the shock knocking the color from her face. I stepped back, giving him space, not out of cruelty, not out of indifference, out of clarity, out of a deep, grounded calm that had taken a lifetime to learn. Evan looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Mom, what did you do?" I didn't answer, because he already knew, and because the truth on the walls spoke louder than anything I could say. He pressed his hand against Sophie's cheek, whispering frantic apologies, but his voice kept shaking. His words kept breaking. He looked around the room again as if seeing for the first time the life he had dismantled piece by piece without ever meaning to, and I simply stood there, silent. Not cold, not triumphant, just steady. Steady in the truth that was long overdue. Steady in the knowledge that this moment was not created by my actions, but by theirs. Steady in the strength of 15 days of quiet clarity. Evan tried again to speak. "Mom, please, we didn't mean—" But the words died in his throat, because intention does not erase impact, because careless choices can wound more deeply than intentional cruelty, and because the evidence on the walls, my history, my memories, my life, told the real story. I let the silence hold him exactly where he needed to be, in truth, in consequence, in the quiet aftermath of choices he had never expected to return to him, and in that silence I felt no anger, only a final, grounded understanding. Sometimes the loudest justice is the one delivered without a single word. In the days that followed the confrontation in the storage room, I expected someone to raise their voice. I expected accusations, or tears, or outrage pushed in my direction. But none of that happened. When the truth is undeniable, people exhaust themselves trying to deny it. And then, life does what life always does. It moves forward, quietly, inevitably, naturally. Sophie recovered quickly from her fainting spell, but the shock left a mark on her face, a kind of dullness behind the eyes that comes from realizing you are not the victim you imagined yourself to be. She avoided looking at me whenever I entered a room, and when she spoke, her voice had lost its earlier brightness. A week later, the consequences began to appear in places I never touched. Sophie's employer called her in for a meeting after conducting an internal review. The company had flagged several personal charges on a corporate card during her Paris trip. Designer clothes, dinners, spa treatments. The same shopping bags she had carried so proudly when she stepped out of the car. She tried to explain. She tried to soften the truth. But truth does not bend for convenience. She was asked to resign. Quietly. Discreetly. They gave her the option to frame it as a personal decision, but everyone in the office knew what had happened. She packed her desk the next morning. Evan's unraveling came more slowly, in the way a rope frays one strand at a time. Debt collectors began calling about the credit cards he had used during their trip, cards he assumed he would pay off once his next bonus arrived. But his job had changed too. Without Sophie's income, their lifestyle cracked under reality. His performance at work slipped. Stress made him short-tempered. Projects fell behind. Eventually, his team lead took him aside and told him they were going in a different direction. A softened version of the truth: he was no longer needed. They let him go at the end of the month. He tried to hide the news from Sophie at first, but silence cannot cover that kind of loss for long. I watched from a distance, not out of triumph, but from the place where clarity lives. This was not revenge. These were the natural consequences of choices made carelessly, repeated thoughtlessly, and justified easily. Decisions accumulate. They always do. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after they returned from Paris, Evan knocked gently on my door, not the front door, my bedroom door. He stood there looking smaller than I remembered, his shoulders slumped, his expression clouded with the weariness of someone learning adulthood all over again. "Mom, we're going to move out for a while," he said. His voice cracked around the edges. "Just until things settle." I nodded, not because I wanted them gone, but because I had learned something important during those 15 quiet days. Sometimes love requires space, and sometimes space requires letting go. I said, "If that's what you need." He swallowed, relieved that I did not make it difficult. Perhaps, after all these years, he finally understood that I never wanted to make anything difficult. I only wanted to stop disappearing. They found a small apartment across town, nothing like the home they had taken for granted. The paint peeled in some corners. The kitchen tiles were chipped. The bedroom barely fit their furniture, but it was theirs, their space, their responsibility. The day they moved out, they carried their boxes with the weary resignation of people who were finally aware of the weight they had created for themselves. Sophie would not meet my eyes. Evan hugged me briefly, the kind of hug that carried an apology but not yet understanding. Maybe understanding would come later. Maybe it wouldn't. Life rarely moves on the timeline we want. After they left, the house felt peaceful again. Not empty. Peaceful. The walls breathed. The rooms settled. I walked through each space slowly, letting my fingers trail along the surfaces the way one might touch old photographs. Not to cling to the past, but to acknowledge it. I did not feel satisfaction in their struggles. I felt something closer to acceptance. People learn in different ways, some through guidance, some through loss, and some through the gentle, unspoken consequences of their own choices. I never repeated their mistakes aloud to anyone. I never blamed them in front of neighbors or friends. I never called to remind them of what their decisions had cost me. I did not need to. Truth teaches on its own schedule. When I thought of them in their small apartment, sharing one car, budgeting carefully, learning the weight of responsibility they had once ignored, I did not feel hardened. I felt human. We all grow differently, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed them the dignity of that growth, even when it came late, especially when it came late. My house was quiet now, but not the lonely kind of quiet, a clean quiet, a chosen one. And in that gentle silence, I finally understood that justice does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives with a simple, natural unfolding of life. One decision, one truth, one consequence at a time. After Evan and Sophie moved out, the house settled into a gentler rhythm, one that felt almost like breathing after holding my lungs tight for too long. For the first time in years, the silence inside these walls did not feel like erasure. It felt like an invitation, a soft space for beginnings. I woke earlier than usual in those first few mornings, letting myself linger by the window, watching sunlight stretch slowly across the yard. The garden outside was overgrown, wild patches of grass, thorny vines, and brown leaves blanketing the soil. It looked nothing like the garden my husband once tended with quiet devotion. He used to kneel in that soil with his old gloves, humming softly as he pruned roses and planted herbs. I had avoided the garden since he passed, afraid that touching it might make the loss feel fresh again. But now, something nudged me gently toward it, like a hand on my back telling me it was time. On a warm afternoon, I put on my gardening gloves, stiff from years of disuse, and stepped onto the uneven stone path. The air smelled of soil and memory. I crouched down and began pulling weeds, trimming dead branches, loosening soil around stubborn roots. It was slow work, quiet work, patient work, the kind of work that asks you to stay present. I found myself humming the way he used to. By the third day, the garden began showing signs of life. New green tips pushed through the soil. Soft patches of color returned where wildflowers had been choked out. While I worked, Mildred walked over from her yard, resting her elbows on the fence. She watched me. For a long moment, her eyes warm. "Kathryn," she said, "I've been waiting for this day." I smiled, brushing dirt from my palms. "What day is that? The day you start returning to yourself." She disappeared for a moment and came back holding a small potted rose bush. Pink, delicate, ready to bloom. She placed it into my hands with the tenderness of someone passing down a blessing. "This is for you, to remind you that you can bloom again, too." Her words settled deep into me, grounding me with a truth I hadn't let myself feel. I planted the rose bush near the spot where my husband once kept his favorite yellow roses. That evening, as the sun dipped low, the new plant caught the last light of the day, glowing softly as if it had been waiting for me. Healing found its way into other corners of my life, too. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center after seeing a flyer posted near the grocery store. I almost walked past it, the old instinct to keep my world small tugging at my sleeve. But something inside me whispered that it was time to stretch again. The first class felt strange. My hands, once so steady from years of work, now shook slightly as I shaped wet clay on a spinning wheel. The instructor, a soft-spoken woman with gray curls, placed her hand lightly over mine and said, "You don't force clay. You guide it. Let it become what it wants to be." I wondered then if she realized she was speaking to more than clay. By the sixth class, I created a small bowl, crooked, uneven, imperfect, but mine. When I brought it home, I placed it in the living room, letting it hold a single white candle. It felt like a quiet victory. As the days passed, thoughts of Evan filled me less with ache and more with acceptance. I realized I no longer replayed old memories to punish myself. I no longer rehearsed what I wished I had said, or what I hoped he might someday understand. Healing doesn't erase what happened. It simply stops letting the wound choose the direction of your life. I still loved my son. That had never changed, but I learned to let that love sit gently instead of letting it bind me. I let go of the old stories, the ones where I was the caretaker, the one who fixed everything, the one who gave until she vanished. I stepped onto the porch one evening, the air soft and warm, and looked at the sky glowing with lavender streaks. I lifted my wrist, the silver bracelet resting there like a familiar heartbeat. I traced its shape with my thumb. The metal felt warm, almost alive. I whispered into the quiet, a soft confession carried only by the breeze. You can rest now. I finally see you. I meant my husband. I meant myself. And in that moment, with the garden blooming again and my hands dusted with clay from a life I was shaping anew, I felt something open inside me, something tender, steady, and entirely my own. The message arrived on a quiet Sunday morning, just as the sunlight began spilling softly across my kitchen counter. I had been trimming the leaves of the rosebush Mildred gave me, humming lightly the way my husband once did, when my phone buzzed with a sound that felt strangely out of place in the peaceful room. The notification showed one name: Evan. I held the phone for a moment before opening it, feeling neither dread nor hope, just a calm curiosity, the same calm that had been growing inside me these past weeks. His message was longer than anything he had sent me in years. Mom, I'm sorry. A real apology. Not for sympathy, not softened by excuses, not shaped by the expectation of forgiveness, just honest words. He wrote about how he had been blind to the ways he leaned on me, how he had let Sophie's preferences become his own, how he had never taken the time to ask what I needed, or how I felt, or whether I was okay. He said he wasn't writing to fix everything. He wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't expecting a reply. He only wanted me to know that he finally understood what he had done, not just recently, but for years. At the end, he wrote, I hope someday we can talk, but I understand if today isn't that day. I set the phone down. I felt no anger, no rush to respond, no urgency to restore anything before its time. Healing has its own pace, and I had learned not to run toward people who needed to learn how to walk toward me. I let the message sit there, unopened in my heart, but not unwelcome. Silence, for once, did not feel like something I was forced into. It felt like something I chose. Later that afternoon, I went to my bedroom and opened the small wooden box on my dresser, the one where I kept my most precious things, memories, not items, things with breath and weight. Inside lay the silver bracelet, warm from the sunlight that reached through the window. I held it in my palm, the metal shaped by years of living, of loving, of enduring. My husband had slipped it on my wrist on our wedding day, whispering something I never forgot. Keep a part of yourself for you. I hadn't understood it then. Not really, but I understood it now. I lifted the bracelet to my cheek for a moment, letting the coolness settle into my skin. Then I placed it gently back inside the wooden box. Not hidden, not discarded, just put to rest. I closed the lid softly, not as an ending, but as a quiet honoring of the woman I had been, and the woman I was still becoming. When I stepped outside, the late afternoon sun washed over the porch in a warm, golden sweep. The garden below glowed with new life. Roses are blooming, herbs sprouting, the soil is breathing again, and in that light I felt a kind of peace that didn't erase the past, but made space for the future. I whispered a truth to myself, a truth that had slowly grown inside me through all the silence, the losses, the rediscoveries. If they cleared everything out of my life, then I have every right to rebuild it in the gentlest way I choose. The words didn't feel sharp. They didn't feel triumphant. They felt like a soft certainty settling into place, the final piece of a puzzle I had been assembling without knowing it. From the porch, I could see the rosebush Mildred gifted me, swaying lightly in the breeze. One of its petals fell, curling softly onto the soil, an ending and a beginning in the same breath. I sat down in my new chair, the one I chose with intention, and let the warm light touch my hands. My house was no longer empty. It was spacious. It made room for breath, for possibility, for a woman who finally knew her own shape. I thought of Evan again, not with bitterness, not with longing, but with a tender kind of distance. He was learning. I was healing. Both of us were moving, separately but forward, and that was enough. Maybe someday I will reply. Maybe someday we would sit in this garden together, talking not as mother and child bound by expectation, but as two people meeting honestly for the first time. That day would come when it was meant to. I closed my eyes, letting the breeze brush gently against my face. I whispered the truth that had rooted itself deep within me. I didn't lose anything. I just reclaimed my place, and if you have ever been treated like something old, something replaceable, something meant to be tucked in a corner and forgotten, remember this: you can begin again, with your own hands, with your own quiet strength, with your own silence guiding you back to yourself.